My hands trembled as I wrapped the measly little box, a cheap trinket wrapped in faded paper. While all around me, the laughter felt like knives dulling my heart. Christmas had become a cruel reminder. No warmth, no kindness, just cold indifference masked by holiday cheer. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I've been living in this cramped two-bedroom apartment on the Lower East Side for 23 years now. Every morning, I wake before dawn to the sound of garbage trucks grinding their way down Delancey Street, their mechanical groaning mixing with the distant rumble of the F train. The smell of stale coffee from the bodega downstairs seeps through my floorboards, along with conversations in Spanish and Mandarin that I've grown to find more comforting than the silence that fills my own four walls. The peeling paint on my bedroom wall has become my confidant, its cracks and bubbles telling stories of winters that froze my pipes and summers that left me gasping for air without proper ventilation. But those walls have also witnessed 23 years of phone calls that went straight to voicemail, text messages that sat unread for days, and birthday cards I carefully selected at the Duane Reade on Grand Street, only to wonder if they were ever opened. This past Christmas morning, December 25th, I sat at my small kitchen table with my phone in my hands, waiting. The radiator clanked its familiar tune while I stared at the screen, hoping for just one call, one message, anything to remind me that I still mattered to the three people I brought into this world. The silence was deafening. It pressed against my chest like the weight of all those years when I thought love meant giving everything and asking for nothing in return. But let me take you back to where this all began. Because the story I'm about to tell you didn't start with that empty Christmas morning. No, it started 42 years ago when I was just 24, standing in a small church in Queens, wearing my grandmother's wedding dress and believing that love could conquer anything. My husband Robert was handsome then, with dark hair and promises that fell from his lips like honey. We honeymooned in the Catskills, staying in a little cabin where we talked about the children we'd have and the life we'd build together in this magnificent, ruthless city. Sarah came first, my beautiful daughter with Robert's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. 2 years later came Michael, a boy who cried less and smiled more, followed by Jessica 3 years after that. For 15 years, I believed we were building something real, a family rooted in love and sacrifice, the kind my own mother had shown me growing up in a tenement building in Brooklyn. I remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and I was folding laundry in our small living room while the children did homework at the kitchen table. Robert came home late, his tie loosened and his breath smelling of bourbon and something else. Something unfamiliar and sharp. He looked at me like I was furniture he'd grown tired of, then announced he was leaving. Not for another woman, he said, but for himself, for freedom, for a life that didn't feel like drowning in responsibility. The divorce papers came 3 weeks later, delivered by a man in a cheap suit who apologized for interrupting my dinner. Robert took half of everything, including half of the college fund I'd been building by sewing clothes for neighbors and babysitting children on weekends. But he left me something else. 3 heartbroken children who suddenly saw their father as an occasional visitor, someone who showed up for birthday parties and soccer games when it was convenient. I became both mother and father overnight. I took a job at Macy's in Herald Square, standing on my feet for 8 hours a day helping other people find the perfect dress for their perfect occasions. My manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, was kind enough to let me switch shifts when the children were sick. But kindness doesn't pay rent. So I took a second job cleaning offices in Midtown Manhattan, riding the subway at midnight with my bucket of supplies and my aching back. Do you know what it feels like to fall asleep on the 6 train at 2 in the morning, clutching your purse and hoping you wake up before your stop? Do you know the particular exhaustion that comes from working 16-hour days so your children can have the same opportunities as their classmates whose parents sleep in warm beds every night? But I told myself it was worth it. Every sacrifice, every missed meal, every night I fell asleep on the couch still wearing my work clothes. All of it was worth it if it meant my children would have better lives than mine. When Sarah wanted to take violin lessons, I found the money. When Michael needed special tutoring for his dyslexia, I worked extra shifts to pay for it. When Jessica broke her leg and needed surgery, I took out a second mortgage on the tiny house we'd managed to buy in Queens. I gave them everything, not because I had to, but because I loved them with a fierce, protective love that made me believe a mother's sacrifice was the purest form of devotion. I convinced myself that one day they would understand. One day they would see that every gray hair on my head, every line around my eyes, every dollar I spent on their dreams instead of my own, all of it was proof of love. But children don't see sacrifice the way we imagine they will. They see it as normal, as something they deserve, as the natural order of things. Sarah graduated from high school and moved to Boston for college, visiting twice a year and calling even less. Michael got involved with a crowd that stayed out all night and came home smelling of disappointment. Jessica, my baby, started treating me like I was embarrassing her simply by existing. The phone calls, when they came, were always the same. "Mom, I need," followed by a number that made my stomach clench. Sarah needed help with rent when her roommate moved out unexpectedly. Michael needed bail money after a misunderstanding at a bar in the village. Jessica needed money for textbooks, for car repairs, for a deposit on an apartment she'd share with boyfriends whose names changed as often as the seasons. And I gave. Of course I gave. Because what else do you do when the people you love are drowning? You throw them every life preserver you have, even if it means you're the one who ends up underwater. By the time I turned 55, I had given away my dreams of traveling to Ireland, where my great-grandmother was born. I had given away my savings account, my emergency fund, and the small inheritance my mother left me when she passed away from cancer. I had given away Friday nights with friends because all my friends were tired of hearing about my children's problems. I had given away pieces of myself until I wasn't sure what was left. But still, I told myself it was temporary. Still, I believed that once they got on their feet, once they found their way, things would change. We would have Sunday dinners again. We would call each other just to talk. We would be a real family. The kind you see in movies where everyone laughs and argues and forgives each other because love is stronger than anything else. I was such a fool. The first crack in my delusion came on a warm spring day when I was visiting Sarah in Boston. She was 28 then, working as a marketing coordinator for a tech company and dating a man named David, who wore expensive watches and talked about his portfolio. I had taken the Greyhound bus from Port Authority, a 4-hour journey that left my back aching and my feet swollen, carrying a suitcase full of her favorite cookies, and a check for $800 to help with her student loan payment. We met for lunch at a cafe in Back Bay, one of those places where a sandwich costs $18, and everyone speaks in whispers about important things. Sarah looked beautiful, dressed in clothes I couldn't afford, her hair professionally styled and her nails perfectly manicured. But when she looked at me, I saw something that made my heart sink. Embarrassment. She introduced me to David as if I were a distant relative she barely tolerated, not the woman who had worked 2 jobs to pay for her education. When I mentioned that I was proud of how well she was doing, she changed the subject quickly, as if my pride was something shameful. And when I handed her the envelope with the check, she took it without meeting my eyes, stuffing it into her purse like it was a grocery list she'd forgotten about. The ride back to New York was the longest 4 hours of my life. I stared out the bus window at the Connecticut landscape rushing past and finally admitted to myself what I'd been avoiding for years. My children were ashamed of me, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I represented something they wanted to leave behind. I was the reminder of where they came from, the cramped apartments, the secondhand clothing, the nights when dinner was peanut butter sandwiches because payday was still 3 days away. I was their past, and their past was poor. The truth hit me like a subway train. I had sacrificed everything to give them a better life, and in doing so, I had made myself someone they no longer wanted to claim. Michael's wedding was the next blow. He had met Rebecca, a woman whose father owned a chain of restaurants in New Jersey. The engagement party was held at a country club in Westchester, the kind of place where I felt like I was trespassing just by walking through the front door. I wore my best dress, a navy blue number I'd bought on sale at Nordstrom Rack, and I practiced conversations in my bathroom mirror for weeks beforehand. But at the party, I found myself standing alone by the cheese table while Rebecca's family laughed and mingled like they owned the world. Michael introduced me to people as my mom, with the same enthusiasm he might have used to introduce a parking meter. And when it came time for toasts, Rebecca's father spoke about welcoming Michael into their family with warmth and pride. But Michael's toast about Rebecca joining ours lasted exactly 37 seconds and mentioned me not once. The wedding itself was beautiful. Expensive flowers, a 4-course meal, a band that played until midnight. I sat at a table with strangers, relatives I didn't know, while my son danced with his new wife surrounded by her family. Rebecca's parents had paid for everything, of course. The flowers alone cost more than I made in 3 months. And I realized, watching my son spin his bride around the dance floor, that I had become a guest at my own child's wedding, not the mother of the groom, not someone whose opinion mattered or whose presence added joy to the occasion, just someone who had to be invited because it would look bad not to. Jessica's graduate school graduation was worse. She was getting her master's degree in social work from Columbia, a program I had helped pay for by taking out loans against my retirement fund. The ceremony was held in a beautiful auditorium on campus, and I sat in the back row wearing the same navy dress from Michael's wedding because I couldn't afford anything new. After the ceremony, there was a reception where families gathered to celebrate their children's achievements. I watched other parents pose for pictures with their graduates, beaming with pride and joy. I waited for Jessica to find me, to introduce me to her classmates and professors, to include me in the celebration of something we had accomplished together. Instead, she spent the afternoon with her boyfriend's family, people who had more money than sense, and who looked at social work as Jessica's phase before she found something more practical. When I finally approached her to congratulate her and ask for a picture together, she was polite but distant, like I was a family friend she hadn't seen in years. "Mom," she said, glancing around to see who might be watching, "maybe we could do pictures later. I'm just so busy right now with everyone." Later never came. I took the subway home alone that night, carrying the flowers I'd bought for her in my lap like a wounded bird. The train was crowded with families heading home from graduations and celebrations, their laughter and excitement surrounding me like a bubble I couldn't burst through. I had never felt more invisible in my life. That's when the phone calls started becoming different, less frequent, but more demanding. Sarah would call when she needed help with a security deposit or when her car broke down. Michael would text when he and Rebecca were fighting about money and he needed a loan to smooth things over. Jessica would reach out when she was between jobs or between boyfriends, needing a place to crash for a few weeks while she figured things out. But there were no calls just to talk, no invitations to dinner, no questions about how I was doing or what was happening in my life. I had become an ATM with a motherly voice, dispensing help when needed but otherwise ignored. The holidays were the worst. For 3 years running, I spent Christmas alone in my apartment, watching other families through their windows as I walked to the corner deli for my solitary dinner. My children were always busy. Sarah with David's family in the Hamptons, Michael and Rebecca with her parents in New Jersey, Jessica with whatever boyfriend had captured her attention that month. They would call on Christmas morning, dutiful conversations that lasted exactly the right amount of time to ease their consciences, but not long enough to actually connect. "Thanks for the gift, Mom. I'm sorry we can't visit this year, but you understand, right?" I always said yes. I always understood, because what else could I say? But last Christmas, something broke inside me. I was sitting at my kitchen table on Christmas Eve, wrapping the presents I'd bought for children who wouldn't be there to receive them. Books Sarah would never read, a sweater for Michael that would sit in his closet unworn, jewelry for Jessica that would disappear into her collection of forgotten gifts from the mother she'd rather forget. The loneliness wasn't new, but that night it felt different, sharper, like a knife that had finally found the exact right angle to pierce something vital. I looked around my apartment, at the small tree I'd decorated with ornaments that held memories no one else cared about, at the stockings hanging from my mantel that would remain empty, at the dining table set for one, and I realized that I had been living a lie for years. I had told myself that love meant giving everything and expecting nothing. I had convinced myself that a mother's job was to sacrifice endlessly, to be available always, to put her children's needs so far above her own that she disappeared into the service of their lives. But sitting there in the silence of my empty apartment, I finally understood the truth. I hadn't been loving my children. I had been enabling them, and in doing so, I had taught them that I had no value except what I could provide. They didn't love me. They loved what I gave them. The realization should have destroyed me, but instead, it lit something inside me that had been dormant for years. Anger. Not the quick flash of irritation when someone cuts you off in traffic, but the slow burn of fury that comes when you realize you've been playing a rigged game for decades. I spent that Christmas Day alone, but instead of wallowing in self-pity, I made a decision. I was done being invisible. I was done being taken for granted. I was done funding the lives of people who treated me like an inconvenience. It was time to find out who my children really were when the money stopped flowing. The first call came on January 3rd. Sarah, breathless and desperate, explaining that David had broken up with her, and she needed first month's rent and security deposit for a new apartment. The usual amount, $3,000. For the first time in 20 years, I said no. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I thought the call had been dropped. Then Sarah's voice came back, strained and confused. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, I'm not sending you money," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You're 30 years old, Sarah. You have a good job. Figure it out. But Mom, I can't ask anyone else. My credit cards are maxed out, and I don't have anywhere else to turn. You always help me. Always." The word hung between us like an accusation. Yes, I had always helped her. Always been there when she needed something. Always said yes when she reached out with her hand extended and her problems laid bare. "I need to think about it," I lied, knowing I had already thought about it, and the answer wouldn't change. Michael called 2 weeks later. He and Rebecca were looking at houses in Westchester, something with a big yard where they could start a family. They needed help with a down payment, just $20,000, which they would pay back once they sold some of Rebecca's father's stock. "I can't do that, Michael," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "What do you mean you can't? You helped Sarah with her apartment in Boston. You helped Jessica with her student loans. It's not like I'm asking for charity. We'll pay you back." But we both knew they wouldn't. None of them ever had. "I'm sorry, but the answer is no." Another long silence, followed by something I'd never heard in my son's voice before. Coldness. "Fine, Mom. I guess I know where I stand." The line went dead. Jessica was last, calling on a rainy Tuesday in March. She had been fired from her job at a nonprofit. Something about a personality conflict with her supervisor. Though from the way she told the story, it was clear the conflict was mostly her inability to show up on time or complete her assignments. She needed money for groceries, for rent, for basic survival while she looked for something new. "I'm not giving you money, Jessica," I said before she could finish her explanation. "Are you serious right now?" Her voice rose to the entitled pitch I remembered from her teenage years. "I'm literally asking for help buying food. What kind of mother refuses to feed her own child? The kind who raised a 31-year-old woman who should be able to feed herself." I hung up before she could respond. For the first time in decades, my phone was quiet. No desperate calls in the middle of the night. No text messages detailing the latest crisis that required my immediate financial intervention. No guilt-laden conversations about how difficult their lives were and how much they needed their mother's help. The silence was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Patricia Chen, whose office was in a converted brownstone on the Upper West Side. She was younger than me but possessed a kind of gentle wisdom that made me feel safe enough to tell the truth about my life. The first few sessions, I cried so much that she kept a box of tissues on the table between our chairs. "Tell me about your relationship with your children," she said during our fourth meeting. "I love them," I said automatically. "I know you love them. But what is your relationship with them actually like?" I sat there for a long time, trying to find words for something I'd never articulated before. Finally, I said, "I'm their ATM." Dr. Chen nodded, like this wasn't a surprise to her. "And how does that feel?" "Expensive," I said, and for the first time in months, I laughed. But the laughter quickly turned into something rawer. "I don't know who I am if I'm not helping them," I admitted. "I don't know what my purpose is if I'm not solving their problems or funding their dreams. For so long, Being their mother has meant being their safety net. If I'm not that, then what am I? You're Margaret, Dr. Chen said simply. You existed before they did, and you'll exist after they find their own way. The question is, who do you want to be? It was a question I hadn't asked myself in 40 years. Meanwhile, my children were not handling my newfound boundaries well. Sarah called my sister Patricia in Albany, complaining that I was having some kind of breakdown and needed intervention. Michael showed up at my apartment unannounced, bringing Rebecca as backup, both of them armed with concerned expressions and rehearsed speeches about family loyalty. Mom, we're worried about you, Rebecca said in the tone she might use with a confused elderly relative. This isn't like you. Cutting off your children, refusing to help when we need you. It's not healthy. I looked at my daughter-in-law, this woman who had never worked a job that didn't come with a trust fund safety net, who had never chosen between paying rent and buying groceries, who had never sacrificed a single dream for someone else's benefit. And I laughed. You're right, Rebecca. It's not like me. The old me would have apologized for worrying you and written a check before you finished talking. But the old me was an idiot. Michael stood up, his face red with frustration. What happened to you? You used to care about us. I still care about you. I just don't care about funding your lifestyle anymore. They left without another word, and I knew it would be a long time before I saw them again. Jessica's response was different but equally predictable. She started a whisper campaign among our extended family, painting me as a bitter old woman who had turned her back on her children. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years began calling with careful questions about my situation, clearly having been fed Jessica's version of events. Margaret, honey, Jessica mentioned that you've been having some financial troubles. My cousin Dorothy from Staten Island said during one particularly awkward conversation. She's so worried about you, and she thinks maybe you're too proud to ask for help. The manipulation was so transparent, it was almost insulting. Jessica had flipped the narrative completely. Now I was the one in need, the one whose pride was getting in the way of accepting my daughter's generous offer of assistance. But I was beyond caring about family gossip or social manipulation. For the first time in my adult life, I was free to think about what I wanted, what I needed, what would make me happy. It was a foreign concept, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I started small. I took the money I would have sent Sarah and bought myself a new winter coat. Not from the clearance rack at TJ Maxx, but from Macy's with the employee discount I'd earned from 15 years of retail work. It was wool, dark green, and warm in a way that felt like luxury. I signed up for a painting class at the community center on East Broadway, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was working multiple jobs and managing everyone else's crises. My first attempts were terrible. Clumsy brushstrokes and muddy colors that looked nothing like the flowers I was trying to recreate. But they were mine. No one else's opinion mattered. I started taking the subway to different neighborhoods, exploring parts of the city I'd lived in for decades but never seen. I spent an afternoon in the Tenement Museum, learning about immigrant families who had faced challenges that made my problems seem manageable. I walked through Central Park on weekdays when it wasn't crowded, feeding ducks and reading books on benches where no one needed anything from me. For the first time since my divorce, I was alone, but not lonely. Spring came early that year, and with it, a surprising phone call. Not from one of my children, but from my neighbor Maria Santos, an older Dominican woman who lived in the apartment next to mine. Maria had always been kind, holding doors, accepting packages when I wasn't home, offering me café con leche when she made extra, but we'd never had more than polite hallway conversations. "Margaret," she said in her careful English, "would you like to come for dinner tonight? My granddaughter is visiting from Washington Heights, and she's making arroz con pollo." I accepted without hesitation, grateful for human company that didn't come with conditions or expectations. Maria's apartment was smaller than mine, but filled with warmth, family photos covering every surface, the smell of garlic and sofrito in the air, salsa music playing softly from an old radio in the kitchen. Her granddaughter Carmen was 26, a nurse at Mount Sinai who spoke passionately about her work with elderly patients. Over dinner, she asked about my life with genuine curiosity, not because she wanted something from me, but because she was interested in who I was as a person. "My grandmother says you worked at Macy's for many years," Carmen said while we cleared the dishes. That must have been hard work being on your feet all day. It was such a simple acknowledgement, but it meant more to me than 20 years of thanks for the check text messages from my own children. Someone saw my work as valuable, worthy of respect, something that mattered beyond the money it provided. Maria and I began having dinner together once a week, sometimes at her apartment, sometimes at mine. She told me stories about growing up in Santo Domingo and coming to New York with nothing but determination and hope. I found myself sharing things I'd never told anyone, not just about my children, but about my dreams, my fears, the woman I'd been before I became someone's mother and someone else's ex-wife. You gave too much, Maria said one evening as we sat on the building's small rooftop garden, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. My mother, she did the same thing. Gave everything to her children until she had nothing left for herself. But you know what happened? I shook my head. They respected her less, not more. When you have no boundaries, people think you have no value. It was a hard truth, but hearing it from someone who understood, someone who had watched her own mother sacrifice endlessly for ungrateful children, made it easier to accept. Summer brought more changes. I started volunteering at a literacy program for elderly immigrants in Chinatown, teaching basic English to women who had spent decades caring for their families without learning to navigate the world outside their homes. Many of them reminded me of myself, intelligent, capable women who had made themselves invisible in service to others. Working with them gave me purpose in a way that writing checks for my children never had. When Mrs. Liu learned to fill out a job application in English, when Mrs. Petrosky was able to talk to her doctor without a translator, when Mrs. Kowalski read her first book in her adopted language. These victories belonged to all of us and diminished none of us. I also started therapy groups at Dr. Chen's recommendation, meeting with other women who had struggled with boundaries and self-worth. We called ourselves the Reformed People Pleasers, and our stories were remarkably similar. Decades of saying yes when we meant no, of giving more than we had to people who took without gratitude, of mistaking exploitation for love. One woman, Helen, was 72 and had been supporting her 45-year-old son for over 20 years. Another, Rosa, had paid for her daughter's wedding, divorce, and 3 subsequent weddings without ever being thanked. We shared strategies for setting boundaries, celebrated small victories, and held each other accountable when we were tempted to fall back into old patterns. The hardest part, Helen said during one particularly difficult session, is accepting that they might never change. We keep thinking that if we just explain ourselves better, if we just make them understand how much we've sacrificed, they'll suddenly become different people. But they won't. The only person we can change is ourselves. It was a lesson I was still learning. As autumn arrived, I realized I had made it almost 10 months without sending money to any of my children. 10 months of keeping the resources I earned for myself, of making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what someone else needed. 10 months of being Margaret instead of just Mom. My bank account, for the first time in decades, had a balance that didn't make me anxious. I had paid off one of my credit cards completely and was making progress on the others. I had bought groceries without calculating whether I could afford both vegetables and meat. I had replaced my broken refrigerator instead of nursing it through another winter with duct tape and prayers. Small luxuries that most people took for granted felt like revolutionary acts of self-care. But the real test was coming. The holidays were approaching, and I knew my children would expect things to return to normal. Christmas had always been my most generous season. Elaborate gifts, expensive dinners, and cash tucked into cards to help with January's bills. They would be expecting my usual performance as the giving tree, showering them with proof of my love in the form of money and presents they neither needed nor appreciated. This year would be different. I started planning in October, not for what I would give them, but for what I would give myself. I booked a room at a small bed and breakfast in Mystic, Connecticut for Christmas week, my first vacation in over 20 years. I researched art classes and wine tastings, bookstores and museums. I planned to spend Christmas morning opening gifts I had bought for myself, eating breakfast at a seaside cafe, taking long walks without anyone needing anything from me. The phone calls started in November, just as I had expected. Sarah went first, casual and confident. "Hey, Mom, what do you want for Christmas this year?" I'm thinking about that silk scarf we saw at Bloomingdale's when you visited last spring. I had never visited Sarah last spring. We hadn't seen each other in over 2 years. But she was laying the groundwork for her own request, creating a fiction of closeness that would make her eventual ask seem reasonable. I don't need anything for Christmas, Sarah. I won't be exchanging gifts this year. Another one of those long, confused silences. What do you mean you won't be exchanging gifts? I mean I won't be buying presents or sending money. I'm going away for the holidays. Going away? Where? With who? The questions came rapid fire, tinged with panic that had nothing to do with concern for my well-being and everything to do with concern for her bank account. I'm going alone, to Connecticut. I'll be back after New Year's. Mom, this is crazy. You can't just skip Christmas. What about family tradition? What about being together? I almost laughed. What family tradition? What togetherness? The last 3 Christmases I had spent alone while they celebrated with other people. The traditions she was suddenly concerned about were the ones that involved my credit card. Nothing more. We can start new traditions when you're ready to actually spend time with me, I said. Until then, I'm spending the holidays with someone who appreciates my company. Myself. Michael's call came 2 days later, and the conversation followed a predictable script. Disbelief, manipulation, guilt-tripping, and finally, anger. He accused me of punishing them for being successful, of being jealous of their happiness, of turning bitter in my old age. You're 66, Mom. How many Christmases do you have left? Do you really want to spend them alone out of spite? The cruelty was breathtaking, even coming from the son who had once cried when I made him apologize to his sister for breaking her toy. But it didn't hurt the way it would have a year ago. Instead, it clarified something I'd been struggling with. These weren't my children anymore. Not really. They were strangers who happened to share my DNA, people who had been shaped by my sacrifices into individuals who couldn't recognize love unless it came with a dollar sign. Jessica's response was the most dramatic, of course. She showed up at my apartment on a cold Tuesday evening in early December, tears streaming down her face, arms full of old photo albums and Christmas ornaments from her childhood. "Look at these, Mom," she said, spreading pictures across my kitchen table like evidence in a trial. "Look at how happy we all were. Remember when we made these ornaments together? Remember when you taught me to make your grandmother's sugar cookies? Remember when we used to watch A Christmas Story together every Christmas Eve?" I looked at the photos. Faded images of Christmas mornings past. 3 children surrounded by more toys than any child needs. Their faces glowing with the temporary joy that comes from getting everything you want. And there I was in the background of most shots, exhausted but smiling, the woman behind the camera who made the magic happen but was rarely the focus of it. "I remember," I said quietly. "I remember working double shifts in November so I could afford all those presents. I remember staying up until 3 in the morning wrapping gifts after you all went to bed. I remember cooking for days to make sure Christmas dinner was perfect, then doing all the dishes afterward while you played with your new toys." Jessica's face crumpled. "We were grateful, Mom. We loved Christmas because of you." "No, Jessica. You loved Christmas because of what I gave you. There's a difference." She tried a different approach, softening her voice to the tone she'd used as a child when she wanted permission to stay up late or have friends over. "I know I've been a bad daughter. I know I haven't called enough or visited enough, but I want to do better. Can't we try again? Can't we have just one more family Christmas?" It was perhaps the most honest thing she'd said to me in years, and for a moment, I felt the familiar tug of maternal instinct, the urge to forgive everything and pretend the hurt had never happened. But then I looked at those photos again, really looked at them, and I saw the truth that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. In every single picture, my children were looking at the presents, not at me. Their joy was focused on things, objects that would be broken or forgotten within a year. Temporary pleasures that required constant renewal. And in every picture, I was looking at them, my face shining with love and pride and the mistaken belief that their happiness was proof of my worth as a mother. "I want to do better too," I told Jessica. "But doing better means not pretending that what we had before was working." "It wasn't working, honey. Not for me." She left the photos on my table and walked out without another word. That night, I sat looking at those faded Christmas memories for a long time. Then I packed them carefully in a box, along with the ornaments and cookie cutters and all the other artifacts of holidays past. Not to throw them away, but to put them where they belonged, in the past, with the woman who thought love meant giving everything and asking for nothing in return. I was definitely going to Connecticut for Christmas. The bed and breakfast was everything I had hoped for. A restored Victorian house overlooking the Mystic River, with a fireplace in every room and breakfast served on antique china. I arrived on December 23rd and was greeted by Margaret, the innkeeper, who was about my age and had a smile that made me feel like I was being welcomed into a friend's home. "First time at the Seahorse Inn?" she asked as she showed me to my room. "First vacation in 20 years, I admitted, feeling slightly embarrassed by the confession. Her eyes lit up with understanding rather than pity. "Well then, we're going to make sure it's perfect. What would you like to do while you're here?" I had a list written on hotel stationery, small adventures that felt enormous to someone who hadn't put her own desires first in decades. Visit the Mystic Seaport Museum, take a harbor cruise, try the wine tasting at the local vineyard, browse the antique shops, sit by the water and read books that no one else had chosen for me. Christmas Eve was magical in a way I hadn't expected. The town was decorated with lights that reflected off the water, and carolers walked through the historic district singing songs that sounded beautiful instead of painful for the first time in years. I had dinner at an old tavern by the harbor, lobster bisque and wine, and a piece of chocolate cake so rich it felt like a celebration. I called Maria from my room that night to check on her and share details of my adventure. She was spending Christmas with Carmen's family in Washington Heights, surrounded by 3 generations of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. "How do you feel?" she asked after I described my day. I thought about the question for a moment, trying to put words to something I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten what it was called. "Free," I said finally. "I feel free." Christmas morning dawned clear and bright, with sunlight streaming through the lace curtains of my room. I had breakfast in the inn's dining room. Fresh fruit and homemade granola and coffee that tasted like luxury instead of necessity. The other guests were couples and families, but I didn't feel lonely watching them share their holiday joy. Instead, I felt grateful to be witnessing happiness that wasn't dependent on my participation or funding. I opened the gifts I had bought for myself, a silk scarf in shades of blue that matched my eyes, a journal bound in soft leather, a bottle of perfume that smelled like spring flowers. Simple pleasures that felt revolutionary because I had chosen them for me, not because someone else needed them or expected them. My phone buzzed throughout the day with text messages from my children. Brief, obligatory greetings that fulfilled the bare minimum requirement of Christmas contact. "Merry Christmas, Mom. Hope you're having a good day." No questions about where I was or what I was doing. No acknowledgement that this was the first Christmas in 40 years they hadn't received presents from me. The messages felt like afterthoughts, and I realized they probably were. I spent the afternoon at Mystic Seaport, walking through the recreated 19th century village and learning about people who had built lives through determination and hard work. Many of them were immigrants who had left everything behind to create something new. People who understood that love sometimes requires letting go of the past to make room for a better future. That evening, I sat by my window overlooking the harbor and wrote in my new journal about the most unusual Christmas of my life. For the first time in decades, I had spent the holiday focused on joy instead of obligation, on receiving instead of giving, on being present for my own experience instead of orchestrating everyone else's. It was the best Christmas I'd had in years. But I knew the real test was still coming. Returning home meant facing the consequences of my choices, dealing with whatever campaign my children had mounted in my absence, and deciding what came next for a woman who had just learned she could survive being selfish. The messages were waiting when I got home. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and 12 voicemails, all from various family members who had apparently been recruited to guilt me back into compliance. My sister Patricia had called 3 times from Albany, my cousin Dorothy twice from Staten Island, and even my ex-husband Robert had left a message expressing concern about my recent behavior. But the most surprising message was from Michael's wife Rebecca, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Margaret, I don't know what game you're playing, but you're hurting your son. Michael has been depressed all week, wondering what he did wrong to make his mother abandon him at Christmas. Whatever point you're trying to make, you've made it. Now please call him back and fix this. The manipulation was sophisticated. I had to give her credit for that. Position me as the villain, Michael as the victim, and herself as the reasonable voice trying to restore family harmony. Paint my first act of self-care in 20 years as abandonment and cruelty. Make my absence about them instead of about me. I deleted the message without calling back. The next few weeks were a study in family dynamics I'd never been forced to observe before. Through Maria, who had her own network of neighborhood gossips, I learned that Sarah had been telling people I was having a breakdown and might need professional help. Michael and Rebecca had started attending my church, playing the part of concerned family members worried about their troubled mother-in-law. Jessica had posted cryptic messages on social media about the importance of forgiveness and family loyalty, clearly hoping I would see them and feel guilty. It was a full-court press designed to force me back into my old role through public pressure and private shame. And a year ago, it would have worked. The old Margaret would have called them all, apologized for worrying them, and written checks to prove that everything was back to normal. But the woman who returned from Connecticut wasn't the same person who had left. She was someone who had spent 3 days focused entirely on her own happiness and discovered she was worth the investment. Someone who had eaten meals without calculating their cost, bought gifts without worrying about next month's bills, and slept through the night without wondering who might need her emergency assistance. Someone who had learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just fear dressed up as virtue. So instead of calling my children, I called a real estate agent. My apartment on the Lower East Side held 40 years of memories, but most of them were painful. The walls that had witnessed decades of frantic phone calls, desperate financial calculations, and sleepless nights worrying about other people's problems. The kitchen table where I'd written countless checks for crises that weren't my own. The phone that had become an instrument of manipulation rather than connection. I found a smaller place in Astoria, Queens, a one-bedroom apartment in a building full of older adults who had chosen independence over obligation. It had a view of the East River, better light than my old place, and no history of disappointment soaked into its walls. The move took 2 months to complete, during which my phone remained remarkably quiet. No one offered to help pack. No one asked where I was going. No one seemed concerned about why I might want to leave the place I'd called home for over 2 decades. Their indifference was the final proof I needed that I was making the right decision. Maria helped me pack, along with Carmen and 2 of her nursing school friends who treated the whole thing as an adventure rather than a crisis. We sorted through 40 years of accumulation, boxes of clothes I'd kept for some day, kitchen gadgets I'd bought during marriage, furniture that had been repaired so many times it was mostly glue and hope. In the back of my bedroom closet, I found a box I'd forgotten about. Letters and cards my children had made for me when they were young. Construction paper hearts that said, "World's Best Mom." Handprint art projects from elementary school. Mother's Day cards pledging eternal love and gratitude. I sat on my bedroom floor reading them. These artifacts from a time when their affection was simple and their needs were clear. When a hug could solve any problem, and a bedtime story was more valuable than money. When they saw me as the center of their universe instead of an embarrassment to be managed. For a moment, I felt the familiar ache of loss, the grief for children who had grown into strangers. But then I looked around at my empty apartment, walls stripped of pictures they'd never asked about, rooms cleared of furniture they'd never helped me move, spaces that would soon belong to someone else's memories. And I realized I wasn't losing my children by moving on. They had already been gone for years. I was just finally admitting it. I kept one card, a Mother's Day creation from Jessica when she was 6, covered in glitter and marker hearts. Not because I was clinging to the past, but because I wanted to remember that there had been real love once, before it got buried under years of guilt and obligation and transactional relationships. The rest went into a box labeled Sarah, Michael, and Jessica that I left in the apartment for them to claim if they ever wanted to. I doubted they would. My first month in Astoria was a revelation. My neighbors were women like Agnes, an 80-year-old retired teacher who had never married and spoke 4 languages. Like Rose, who had raised 2 children alone after her husband died and was now pursuing a degree in art history at Queen's College. Like Elena, who had escaped an abusive marriage at 65 and was learning to salsa dance. We had potluck dinners in the community room and book clubs in each other's apartments. We faced our health scares together, celebrated small victories, and shared the kind of honest conversation that comes from having survived enough life to know what matters. For the first time since my divorce, I was part of a community that valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Spring came early again that year, and with it, another surprise. Sarah called on a Tuesday evening in March, her voice uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. "Mom, I got your new address from Patricia. Can we talk?" I almost said no. The old Margaret would have said yes immediately, grateful for any contact no matter how belated or conditional. But the new Margaret had learned to ask herself what she wanted before responding to what other people needed. What I wanted was to hear what she had to say. "I can talk for 20 minutes, I said, setting a boundary that felt foreign in my mouth. "I have plans this evening." I did have plans. Dinner with Agnes and Rose, followed by a movie at the local art house theater. Plans that belonged to me, that made me happy, that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or participation. "I wanted to apologize," Sarah said, the words coming out in a rush like she was afraid she'd lose her nerve. "For Christmas. For not calling more. For everything, I guess." It was a start, but I'd learned not to mistake words for change. "What are you apologizing for specifically?" Another pause. "For taking you for granted. For only calling when I needed something. For not visiting or checking on you, or for not being a better daughter." The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we could cross. Part of me wanted to rush in with reassurance, to tell her it was okay, that I understood, that we could go back to the way things were. But going back wasn't an option, and understanding didn't erase the pain of 20 years of one-sided relationships. "Thank you for saying that," I said carefully. "It means something to hear you acknowledge it. I want to do better, Mom. I want us to have a real relationship, not just whatever we had before." "What does that look like to you?" She was quiet for so long I thought she might hang up. Finally, she said, "I don't know. I don't think I know how to be your daughter without asking for things. That's terrible, isn't it?" It was terrible, but it was also honest. More honest than she'd been with me in years. "We could start by getting to know each other again," I said. "As people, not just as mother and daughter. I'd like to know who you are when you're not in crisis mode." "I'd like that too. Could I take you to lunch sometime?" My treat, obviously. "And not because I need anything, just because I want to see you." Obviously. The fact that she felt the need to clarify that she would pay spoke volumes about how our relationship had functioned for decades. But it was also progress. "I'd like that," I said. "But Sarah? This is a new start, not a return to the old way of doing things. I'm not the same person I was a year ago." "I know. Patricia told me about Connecticut, about you spending Christmas alone. I couldn't understand it at first, but I think I get it now. We made you feel alone even when we were together, didn't we?" It was the most insightful thing she'd said to me in years. "Yes," I said simply. "You did." We made plans to meet the following Saturday at a small cafe in Manhattan, neutral territory where we could have the kind of conversation we'd never managed to have in 40 years of being related to each other. Michael's call came 3 days later, but his approach was different from Sarah's. Where she had offered vulnerability, he offered bargaining. "Mom, Rebecca and I have been talking, and we think we made some mistakes in how we handled things. We'd like to make it up to you. Maybe we could take you to dinner, somewhere nice. And we've been thinking about that down payment situation. Maybe there's a way we could work it out that would be good for everyone." Still transactional. Still focused on what he could get from me rather than what he could offer. Still missing the entire point of why I'd walked away in the first place. "I'm not interested in working out financial arrangements, Michael. If you want to have dinner because you enjoy my company, that's one thing. But I'm not going to be your backup bank anymore." "God, Mom, when did you become so cold? You used to care about our success, about our dreams. Now it's like you don't even want us to be happy." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth wrapped in manipulation. I did want them to be happy, but I wanted them to be happy through their own efforts, their own choices, their own resources. Financial independence wasn't coldness. It was love tough enough to let them fail and learn and grow into people who could appreciate what they had without needing someone else to pay for it. I want you to be happy, Michael. I just don't want to be responsible for financing your happiness anymore. He hung up without saying goodbye. Jessica didn't call at all, but Carmen mentioned running into her at a Starbucks in Midtown, where Jessica had apparently spent 20 minutes complaining to anyone who would listen about her selfish mother who had abandoned her family and was probably going through some kind of mental health crisis. The smear campaign didn't surprise me, but it also didn't hurt the way it would have a year earlier. Let her tell whatever story made her feel better about losing her personal ATM. The people who mattered, Maria, Agnes, Rose, Elena, the women in my therapy group, knew who I really was. My lunch with Sarah was awkward at first, full of conversational false starts and careful politeness. We were like strangers trying to find common ground, which in many ways, we were. But gradually, as we picked at our salads and stumbled through small talk, something genuine began to emerge. She told me about her job in ways that didn't involve needing money, the challenging client campaigns, the office politics, the satisfaction of seeing her ideas succeed. She talked about David not as someone who had abandoned her financially, but as someone who had never really known her as anything more than a convenient girlfriend. I realized after he left that I didn't know who I was when I wasn't trying to be what someone else wanted, she said. And I recognized the revelation as one I'd had myself not long ago. It's scary, isn't it? Learning to be yourself instead of what you think other people need. She nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I think I learned it from you, actually. The way you always tried to be whatever we needed instead of just being yourself. I did the same thing with work, with boyfriends, with friends, always trying to prove I was worth keeping around. It was a painful mirror to hold up, seeing my own patterns reflected in my daughter's life. But it was also hopeful. If she could recognize the pattern, maybe she could change it. We didn't solve 40 years of dysfunction over lunch, but we made a start. Sarah asked about my new apartment, my volunteer work, my painting classes. She shared pictures of a pottery class she'd started taking, a hobby that had nothing to do with advancing her career or impressing anyone else. Could I see your paintings sometime? She asked as we prepared to leave. I'd like that, I said, and meant it. Michael never called back, but Rebecca did, 6 weeks later. Her approach was different from before. Less manipulation, more genuine confusion. Margaret, I need to understand something. Michael says you've cut us off completely, but Sarah says you had lunch together and seemed happy. What's going on? I explained the difference between Sarah's approach and Michael's, between asking for a relationship and asking for money, between acknowledging past mistakes and continuing to make them. So, if Michael called and apologized, you'd have lunch with him too? If he apologized sincerely, without trying to leverage it into financial assistance, yes. But you won't give us money for the house? No, I won't give you money for the house. She was quiet for a long time. Then, surprising me, she said, I think maybe that's good. Michael has never had to really work for anything, you know. His mom always bailed him out, and then he married me, and my dad takes care of the big stuff. Maybe it's time he figured some things out on his own. It was more insight than I'd expected from Rebecca, and it gave me hope that maybe there was more to her than I'd given her credit for. Michael might not see it that way at first, I warned her. Michael sees a lot of things wrong at first, but he usually comes around eventually. I hoped she was right. Summer brought unexpected gifts. Sarah started calling every few weeks, conversations that lasted minutes instead of seconds, and focused on life instead of crises. She told me about books she was reading, restaurants she'd discovered, a hiking group she'd joined in the Catskills. I shared stories from my volunteer work, updates on my painting progress, descriptions of my neighbors' adventures. Slowly, we began to remember how to be related to each other. Carmen invited me to a family barbecue in Washington Heights, where I met 3 generations of her family and was welcomed with the kind of warmth I'd forgotten existed. Her great-aunt Rosa, who was 92 and had raised 6 children mostly alone, pulled me aside during dessert. Maria tells me your children, they take advantage. she said in the direct way of someone who'd lived too long for diplomatic nonsense. I nodded, unsure how to respond. My youngest son, he did the same thing, always needing money, always having emergencies. I gave and gave until I had nothing left. You know what happened? What? He moved to Florida and didn't call for 3 years. The ones I helped the least, they call every week. Funny how that works, no? It was funny, in the way that painful truths often are. Dr. Chen and I spent that summer working through the complicated emotions of being a mother who had chosen herself over her children's convenience. Guilt and relief lived side by side in my chest, along with grief for the relationships that might have been, and hope for the ones that still might be. Healthy relationships require 2 people to show up, she reminded me during one particularly difficult session when I was second-guessing my boundaries with Michael. You showed up for 40 years. Now it's their turn. Fall arrived with a phone call that changed everything. Not from one of my children, but from a lawyer in Boston I'd never heard of. Mrs. Thompson? This is James Morrison with Morrison Delacroix and Associates. I'm calling about the estate of Eleanor Whitmore. The name meant nothing to me at first. Then I remembered Eleanor Whitmore had been my great-aunt on my mother's side, a woman I'd met exactly 3 times at family funerals. She'd never married, never had children, and had spent her later years traveling the world with money she'd inherited from her own childless aunt. I'm sorry to inform you that Ms. Whitmore passed away last month, the lawyer continued. You've been named in her will. I almost laughed. The timing was so absurd it felt like a cosmic joke. Just when I'd learned to live without depending on anyone else's resources, someone I barely knew was leaving me something in her will. What kind of something? I asked. $2 million, Mrs. Thompson, plus some personal effects and a letter she wanted you to have. The room spun around me. $2 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to change every aspect of my life if I wanted to change it. But as the lawyer explained the details of probate and inheritance taxes and all the administrative details of unexpected wealth, I realized something surprising. I didn't want to change my life. Not dramatically, anyway. I liked my small apartment in Astoria. I loved my volunteer work and my painting classes and my evenings with Maria. I enjoyed the freedom of making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. But I didn't need luxury to be happy. What I had was enough, more than enough. The letter from Eleanor Whitmore explained everything. Dear Margaret, we barely knew each other, but I knew your mother well before you were born, and I've been watching your life from a distance through family gossip and holiday cards. I heard about your divorce, about you raising 3 children alone, about all the sacrifices you made for their education and opportunities. I also heard, more recently, that those children have not treated you with the respect and gratitude you deserve. Your sister Patricia mentioned that you'd stopped supporting them financially and that they were not handling it well. She said you seemed happier but worried that you were becoming too independent in your old age. Too independent. As if independence were something to apologize for in a woman who spent 40 years serving others. I'm leaving you this money not because I think you need it to survive. You've proven you can do that on your own. But because I want you to have the power that comes with financial freedom, the power to choose generosity instead of being required to give, the power to say no without worrying about consequences, the power to live the last decades of your life on your own terms. Use it wisely. Use it selfishly. Use it joyfully. You've earned it. Eleanor. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of grief or relief, but tears of recognition. Eleanor Whitmore understood something that my own children had never grasped. That love without choice isn't love, and generosity without boundaries isn't generosity. She had given me not just money, but permission to be free. The inheritance took 4 months to process, during which I told no one except Maria about my unexpected windfall. I wanted time to think, to plan, to imagine what financial freedom might look like for someone who had learned to be happy with very little. Christmas was approaching again. My second Christmas since walking away from the old patterns. Sarah called in early December to ask about holiday plans, and I realized with surprise that I was looking forward to the conversation. I was thinking of having a small dinner, she said carefully. Nothing fancy, just me and maybe a few friends. Would you like to join us? It was the first invitation I'd received from any of my children in over 2 years. I'd like that, I said. Can I bring something? Just yourself, Mom. That's all I want. Michael called 2 days later, his voice awkward but determined. Mom, I wanted to apologize. For real this time, not because I want something. Rebecca helped me understand that I've been treating you like a bank instead of a mother, and that's not okay. I waited, having learned that the first apology is often followed by a but that negates everything that came before it. I know I don't deserve forgiveness right away, he continued. And I know you don't owe me anything, especially after how I acted. But if you're willing to try, I'd like to learn how to be your son again instead of your burden. It was the most mature thing I'd ever heard him say. I'd like that too, Michael. Sarah mentioned she was making Christmas dinner. Would it be okay if Rebecca and I joined? I promise we won't ask for anything except a chance to spend time with you. For the first time in years, Christmas felt like a possibility instead of an obligation. Jessica was the holdout, still committed to her narrative of abandonment and betrayal. Through family gossip, I learned that she had moved in with a boyfriend whose mother was appalled by Jessica's disloyalty to her own family. The irony was rich. Jessica had found someone else's mother to disapprove of her behavior. Carmen thought it was hilarious. Some people have to lose everything before they learn what's worth keeping, she said with the wisdom of someone who had watched her own siblings make similar mistakes. Christmas Eve, I made a decision that would have been impossible a year earlier. I wrapped 3 envelopes in elegant paper and placed them under Sarah's small tree, next to the bottles of wine and homemade cookies I'd contributed to the dinner. When it came time to exchange gifts, Sarah handed me a beautiful scarf she'd chosen herself, not expensive, but thoughtful, in colors that matched my favorite painting. Michael and Rebecca gave me a framed photograph from my recent art class exhibition, where 3 of my paintings had been selected for display. I had never received gifts that showed such careful attention to who I was becoming, rather than who I used to be. I have something for you too, I said, handing them the envelopes. Sarah opened hers first and gasped. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a letter explaining Eleanor's inheritance and my decision about how to use it. Sarah, this is not a return to the old way of doing things. This is not payment for good behavior or a reward for apologizing. This is a gift from someone who has learned the difference between giving from love and giving from obligation. Use it for something that matters to you: education, travel, a down payment on a home, starting a business. Use it to build something that will make you proud of yourself, not dependent on anyone else. I have learned that the greatest gift I can give you is not money, but the knowledge that you are capable of taking care of yourself. This money is a head start, not a lifetime subsidy. I love you, Mom. Michael's letter was similar, though I adjusted the advice to acknowledge his marriage and his different relationship with money. Rebecca cried when she read it, and I realized that she had been as trapped by the old patterns as the rest of us, always playing the role of the practical daughter-in-law trying to manage her husband's childish relationship with his mother. I don't understand, Sarah said, staring at the check like it might disappear. Where did this money come from? And why now? I told them about Eleanor Whitmore, about the letter, about the strange gift of being given financial freedom by someone who understood what it meant to choose independence over obligation. There's more where that came from, I admitted. Enough that I could go back to the old way of handling things, bailing you out of every crisis and funding every dream. But I won't do that, even though I can afford to now. Michael looked confused. Why not? If you have the money, why not help us? Because helping you and enabling you are 2 different things. This gift, this is help. It's a one-time investment in your ability to build independent lives. Everything else you figure out on your own. I could see them processing this, trying to understand how someone could have resources and choose not to share them freely. It was a concept that challenged everything they thought they knew about motherhood and family obligation. But I also saw something else in their faces: respect. For the first time in years, they were seeing me not as an endless resource to be managed, but as a person with agency and boundaries and the right to make my own choices about my own life. We spent the evening talking in ways we never had before, about dreams that didn't require my funding, about mistakes that had taught them things, about the future they wanted to build with their own hands. Sarah talked about the pottery classes that had become a passion, about possibly opening a small studio someday. Michael mentioned an idea for starting a landscaping business, something physical and creative that would be entirely his. For the first time, I felt like I was having dinner with my adult children instead of my financial dependents. Jessica called 3 days after Christmas, her voice small and uncertain. Sarah told me about the money, she said without preamble. About the inheritance and the gifts. I waited. I guess I missed out because I was too proud to apologize. This isn't about punishment, Jessica. It's about relationship. Sarah and Michael spent months learning how to talk to me without asking for money. You're welcome to do the same. What if I apologize now? What if I promise to do better? I could hear the calculation in her voice, the same financial desperation that had driven all her previous attempts at reconciliation. Then I'd be happy to have a relationship with you. But apologies that are motivated by money aren't really apologies, are they? She hung up without another word. 6 months later, she called again. This time, her voice was different. Tired, genuine, stripped of the entitled anger I'd grown accustomed to. Mom, I lost my job last week, and my boyfriend kicked me out. And I know you're going to say this is exactly what I deserve, but I'm not going to say that, Jessica. I'm sorry you're having a hard time. Really? Really? You're my daughter. I don't want you to suffer. But you won't help me. I won't give you money if that's what you mean. But I'll listen. I'll offer advice if you want it. I'll be here if you need someone to talk to. It wasn't what she wanted, but it was what I could offer. We talked for 20 minutes about practical strategies for job searching, about resources for temporary housing, about the difference between solving problems and learning from them. This is really hard, Mom, she said at the end of our conversation. I know it is. Hard things usually teach us the most. Did you learn that when Dad left us? I learned it this year, when I decided to save myself instead of waiting for you kids to fix things that were broken. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, maybe I need to learn how to save myself too. Maybe you do. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. A year later, Jessica had found a job she liked with a nonprofit that helped women transition out of abusive relationships. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She was learning to help other people establish boundaries and independence while learning to do the same for herself. She called me on Mother's Day, not to ask for anything, but to thank me. For what? I asked. For refusing to enable me. I hated you for it at the time, but I understand now. All those years when you kept rescuing me, I never learned how to rescue myself. And now? Now I know I can take care of myself. It feels powerful. I knew exactly what she meant. Sarah had used her $50,000 to open the pottery studio she'd dreamed about, starting small in a shared space in Brooklyn, but growing steadily as word spread about her work. She invited me to the grand opening of her first solo exhibition, and I stood in the gallery surrounded by beautiful things she had created with her own hands, feeling prouder than I'd ever felt watching her open Christmas presents I couldn't afford. Michael and Rebecca had bought a small house in Queens, not the Westchester mansion they'd originally wanted, but a cozy place with a garden where they could grow vegetables and host barbecues for friends. Michael started his landscaping business and called me every few weeks to share stories about difficult clients and successful projects. Conversations that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the satisfaction of building something with your own efforts. As for me, I discovered that having money was less important than learning I didn't need it to be happy. I used Eleanor's gift carefully, paying off my remaining debts, setting aside funds for future care, donating generously to the literacy program and other causes that mattered to me. But the real gift wasn't the inheritance. It was learning that I deserved to be treated with respect and gratitude, that love without boundaries is just fear wearing a mask, and that the people who truly care about you will find ways to show it that don't involve your bank account. I'm 70 now, and I wake up every morning in my small apartment in Astoria, grateful for the life I've built from the ashes of the life I used to accept. Maria and I take walks along the East River, pointing out changes in the skyline and sharing stories about the people we used to be. Agnes and I have season tickets to the local theater. and Rose and I have started learning Spanish together so we can better communicate with our neighbors. My children call regularly now, not because they need anything, but because they want to stay connected. Sarah brings me pottery she's made, pieces too beautiful to sell but perfect for holding flowers from the farmer's market. Michael stops by when he's working in the neighborhood, sharing coffee and stories from his truck. Even Jessica visits sometimes, usually with updates about her client's progress and questions about my own journey toward independence. They're not perfect relationships. We're still learning how to navigate the space between connection and autonomy, between love and respect. But they're honest relationships, built on choice rather than obligation, nurtured by genuine interest rather than financial necessity. And I finally understand what Eleanor Whitmore meant about having the power to choose generosity. When I give gifts now, they mean something because they're not expected. When I offer help, it's appreciated because it's not assumed. When I say I love my children, they believe me because they know I love myself enough to set boundaries. The holidays are what they should have been all along. Celebrations of people who genuinely enjoy each other's company, not performances designed to extract maximum benefit from the one person who can't say no. Sometimes I think about the woman I was 3 years ago, wrapping that measly little gift with trembling hands while feeling invisible in my own life. I have compassion for her, but I don't miss her. She was someone who confused love with sacrifice and mistook being needed for being valued. The woman I am now knows the difference. I still volunteer at the literacy program, but I've also started teaching art classes for seniors who want to try something new later in life. My students remind me that it's never too late to discover talents you didn't know you had, to find joy in unexpected places, to create something beautiful from materials that seemed ordinary until you learned how to use them properly. My own paintings have improved dramatically, and I've sold several pieces at local art fairs. Not because I need the money, but because there's something powerful about creating something valuable enough that strangers want to pay for it. Last month, I traveled to Ireland to see the village where my great-grandmother was born. It was my second solo vacation, and like the first one, it reminded me that I am excellent company for myself. I walked through ancient ruins and modern cities, stayed in small inns and grand hotels, ate meals I chose and took photographs that pleased no one but me. In a small shop in County Cork, I found a piece of pottery that reminded me of Sarah's work. Not similar in style, but similar in the evident love the creator had put into making something purely for the joy of creating it. I bought it not because Sarah would appreciate the gesture, but because it made me happy to imagine giving her something that would make her smile. The difference between that purchase and every desperate gift I'd bought my children over the years was profound. I wasn't buying love or forgiveness or obligation. I was simply choosing to share joy with someone whose joy mattered to me. That's what healthy love looks like, I've learned. Not the desperate giving of someone who fears abandonment, but the free choice of someone who has enough love for herself that she can afford to share it generously without emptying her own reserves. As I sit here now, looking out at the East River from my small balcony, watching the sun set over Manhattan's glittering skyline, I'm filled with a peace I never imagined possible. Not because my life is perfect, none of our lives are perfect, but because my life is mine. I make the choices, I set the boundaries. I decide what love looks like, and what respect feels like, and what joy means in the context of my own daily existence. My children have learned to love me without requiring me to fund their affection, and I have learned to love them without sacrificing my own dignity in the process. We have all become more ourselves, and in doing so, we have become more genuinely connected. The holidays still come every year, but now they feel like celebrations rather than obligations. My phone rings with invitations instead of demands. My calendar fills with activities I've chosen rather than duties I've accepted out of fear. And sometimes, when I'm wrapping a gift I've chosen with care from money I've earned through my own efforts, I remember that trembling woman from 3 years ago, and I want to tell her what I wish someone had told me decades earlier. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not what you provide. You deserve relationships that nourish you instead of depleting you. You deserve to be seen and valued and appreciated by the people you love, not just tolerated as a necessary evil in their pursuit of what they want from you. And if the people in your life can't love you that way, You deserve to find people who can, or, if necessary, you deserve to learn to be enough all by yourself. Because you are enough. You were always enough. The people who made you feel otherwise were wrong about your value, not right about their entitlement to it without reciprocation. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever loved someone so much that you lost yourself in the process of trying to prove that love? Have you ever realized that you were being valued more as a resource than as a person? If this story feels familiar, please share your experience in the comments below. And if this message resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. It helps me continue sharing these honest conversations about the complicated realities of family, love, and the courage it takes to choose yourself when everyone else expects you to disappear into service of their needs. Because in the end, the greatest gift we can give the people we love is a demonstration of what self-respect looks like. Not selfishness, but self-respect. Not cruelty, but boundaries. Not abandonment, but the modeling of healthy relationships built on mutual respect, rather than one-sided sacrifice. Sometimes love means saying no. Sometimes it means walking away. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it means finding your way back to relationships that are worthy of the name, connections built on choice rather than convenience, nurtured by genuine affection rather than financial necessity, sustained by people who know your worth because they've learned their own. That's the kind of love worth having, and that's the kind of love worth becoming someone who deserves it.